What if I told you that the most important political event in human history was orchestrated by a collectible toy? That democracy, capitalism, and the entire future of human civilization hung in the balance because of something you could buy at a convenience store for $12? Now, before you dismiss this as the fever dream of someone who spent too much time on TikTok, consider this. Harvard researchers discovered we make snap judgments about content within 7 seconds. 7 seconds to decide if something's worth our attention. 7 seconds to determine if a story will change how we see the world. So here's my question. If you had 7 seconds to save democracy, capitalism, or whatever economic system keeps your morning coffee flowing, would you spend it laughing at a kawaii creature? Or would you realize that sometimes the most absurd scenarios reveal the most profound truths about human nature? Because what we're about to explore isn't really about communists disappearing into the void of a collectible toy's belly. It's about power vacuums, ideological balance, and what happens when one side of humanity's eternal philosophical wrestling match suddenly taps out. It's about discovering that maybe, just maybe, we need our ideological enemies more than we'd like to admit. See, Labubu isn't just some random Chinese designer toy that became a global phenomenon. This little pink nightmare represents something deeper. Our collective obsession with cute things that harbor dark secrets. Kind of like how political ideologies work. Actually, they start cute, equality for all, or individual freedom, then reveal their vampire teeth when nobody's looking. But what if those teeth serve a purpose? What if the very tension between opposing ideas is what keeps our world spinning? And what would happen if that tension suddenly disappeared? Today, we're going to follow this ridiculous premise down a rabbit hole that leads to some uncomfortable truths about power, balance, and why the universe might actually have a sense of humor. Because if you can't find meaning in the absurd, you're probably not looking hard enough. The first reports came from Beijing at 3:47 a.m. local time. Xi Jinping's security detail found his bedroom empty, with only a faint smell of strawberry bubble gum lingering in the air. By 4:15 a.m., similar reports flooded in from Moscow, Havana, and Pyongyang. Every single member of every communist party, from the highest-ranking officials to the college kid who just bought his first Che Guevara t-shirt, had simply evaporated into thin air. The only common thread? Security cameras worldwide captured the same inexplicable footage. Tiny pink figures with vampire teeth, no bigger than your thumb, appearing moments before each disappearance. They moved with purpose, wielding what looked like miniature technological devices that seemed to bend reality around them. Then, as quickly as they appeared, they vanished, taking their human cargo with them. Dr. Sarah Chun, a behavioral economist at MIT, was among the first to grasp the magnitude of what had occurred. We're not just talking about political leaders, she explained to a hastily assembled emergency session of the UN Security Council. We're talking about approximately 100 million people worldwide. Teachers, writers, philosophers, union leaders, environmental activists, anyone who had ever genuinely embraced communist ideology, not just as a political affiliation, but as a worldview. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Stock markets around the world experienced the strangest rally in history. Without the ideological counterweight of communist opposition, capitalist systems suddenly found themselves in uncharted territory. It was like a tug of war where one side suddenly let go of the rope. Everyone else went flying backward. But here's where it gets interesting from a biological perspective. You know how ecosystems work? Remove the wolves, and the deer population explodes, then crashes from overgrazing. Remove the predators, and the whole system collapses. Political ecosystems, it turns out, follow similar rules. Within 72 hours of what the media dubbed the pink abduction, labor unions worldwide began fragmenting. Without the philosophical framework of class struggle, workers found themselves unable to articulate why they deserved better conditions. They knew something was wrong, but the vocabulary for expressing collective action had been literally vacuumed out of human consciousness. Corporate executives, initially celebrating, soon discovered something terrifying. Nobody was left to blame for society's problems. For decades, capitalism had defined itself in opposition to communism. Now, faced with homelessness, inequality, and environmental destruction, they couldn't simply point east and say, "At least we're not them." They were forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that maybe, just maybe, some problems were inherent to their own system. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Dr. Marcus Webb, a social psychologist at Oxford, observed something unprecedented. Humans are dialectical creatures. We define ourselves in opposition to others. Republicans need Democrats, atheists need believers, and apparently, capitalists need communists. Remove one side of that equation, and identity itself becomes unstable. This instability manifested in bizarre ways. Conservative politicians found themselves unable to complete sentences that used to flow effortlessly. We must fight against. They would stammer, their minds searching for an enemy that no longer existed. Liberal politicians, meanwhile, discovered that many of their own positions have been shaped by opposition to communist extremes. Without that anchor point, their ideological compass spun wildly. The strangest part? Nobody could remember exactly what communism was anymore. The absence of its practitioners had somehow erased the living memory of the ideology itself. People knew it had existed. There were books, historical records, museums, but the emotional and intellectual understanding of what it meant to believe in collective ownership, class struggle, and workers' revolution had vanished along with its believers. Children asked their parents, "What's a communist?" And parents found themselves unable to explain. They could recite dictionary definitions, but the deeper meaning, the passion, the hope, the critique of capitalism that had driven billions of people throughout history was simply gone. It was as if humanity had undergone a collective lobotomy, removing not just people, but ideas. And in that absence, something even stranger began to emerge. But the true horror wasn't what had disappeared. It was what was beginning to take its place. Nature abhors a vacuum, and apparently, so does human consciousness. Within weeks of the Great Vanishing, something unprecedented began happening. People started inventing new forms of opposition to fill the void. It began in corporate boardrooms, where executives found themselves inexplicably arguing against their own proposals. "We should maximize profits," a CEO would announce, then immediately feel compelled to counter. "But wait, shouldn't we consider the workers?" They had no philosophical framework for this second thought. The communist vocabulary was gone, but the human need for dialectical thinking remained. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a neuroscientist at Stanford, conducted emergency brain scans on world leaders and found something remarkable. The human brain literally requires opposition to function optimally, she explained to a bewildered scientific community. Areas responsible for critical thinking, creativity, and moral reasoning light up most vibrantly when processing conflicting ideas. Remove one side of any ideological spectrum, and cognition itself begins to deteriorate. This deterioration manifested in increasingly surreal ways. Without communists to oppose them, capitalist nations began creating artificial communist movements. The CIA, which had spent decades fighting communist infiltration, suddenly found itself in the bizarre position of creating fake communist cells just to give their agents something to do. The stock market, initially euphoric, began behaving erratically. Traders discovered that without the threat of communist revolution, they had no framework for understanding risk. "We used to price in political instability," explained Wall Street veteran Janet Morrison. "Revolutionary threats, nationalization risks, ideology-based trade wars. Without those factors, our entire risk assessment model collapsed. We were making investment decisions in an ideological vacuum." This created what economists dubbed the meaning crisis. Workers showed up to their jobs, but couldn't articulate why they deserved wages. Employers offered paychecks, but couldn't explain why they owned the means of production. The basic assumptions underlying economic relationships, assumptions that had been clarified through centuries of ideological conflict, suddenly seemed arbitrary and inexplicable. Religious institutions faced a parallel crisis. For decades, Christianity had defined itself partly in opposition to godless communism. Without that opposition, faith communities found themselves struggling to articulate what they stood for, rather than what they stood against. Church attendance plummeted as believers discovered that much of their religious identity had been negative definition. Not communist, Not atheist, not collectivist, rather than positive affirmation. Universities descended into intellectual chaos. Political science departments couldn't teach comparative government without one side of the comparison. Philosophy courses ground to a halt when professors realized that major thinkers like Marx, Lenin, and Gramsci weren't just absent from the curriculum. They had been erased from human memory entirely. Students read references to communist responses to various philosophical arguments and found these passages literally incomprehensible. But the most disturbing development was what psychologists began calling ideological phantom limb syndrome. Just as amputees continue to feel sensations from missing limbs, societies began experiencing political sensations from their missing ideological opposition. People would gather for rallies against something they couldn't name, holding signs with slogans that made no sense. Down with those people. Children born after the vanishing displayed even stranger symptoms. Dr. Maria Santos, a developmental psychologist in Sao Paulo, documented cases of kids inventing elaborate fantasy games where they played both sides of conflicts they couldn't understand. One child would play capitalist, then immediately switch to playing the other thing. But when asked what the other thing was, they'd get confused and frustrated. Their developing brains knew something was missing from the world's ideological ecosystem. The environmental movement, perhaps ironically, suffered the most. Climate activism had been deeply intertwined with anti-capitalist critique for decades. Without the vocabulary to challenge unlimited growth, corporate power, and profit-driven environmental destruction, environmentalists found themselves reduced to politely asking corporations to please consider being nicer to nature. The radical edge that had driven meaningful change evaporated along with those who had provided the theoretical framework for systemic critique. Tech companies, initially celebrating the disappearance of communist opposition to their data harvesting practices, soon discovered an unexpected problem. Innovation stagnated. Turns out, admitted a former Google executive, we did our best work when we had to defend our business models against fundamental criticism. Without philosophical opposition, we just stopped thinking critically about what we were building. Social media platforms, designed to amplify political conflict, began malfunctioning in profound ways. Algorithms trained to promote engagement through ideological warfare started suggesting increasingly bizarre content when half of human political thought simply wasn't available to fight about. Users found themselves arguing passionately about whether pineapple belonged on pizza because their brains desperately needed anything to argue about. The dating world became particularly surreal. Political compatibility apps crashed when they couldn't process users who defined themselves as not communist without having any understanding of what communism meant. Dating profiles began featuring increasingly specific micro-identities as people desperately sought ways to differentiate themselves from others in a world where one of the major axes of human difference had been erased. And through it all, reports continued trickling in of tiny pink figures spotted around the world, always at the edges of vision, always disappearing before anyone could get a clear look. Security agencies began what they called Operation Tiny Teeth, attempting to track down these Labubu creatures, but every lead ended in empty rooms smelling faintly of strawberry bubblegum. The question haunting everyone's dreams: where had they taken the communists, and what did they want? The answer would prove stranger than anyone imagined, and more revealing than anyone was prepared for. 3 months after the Great Vanishing, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, a quantum physicist at Tokyo University, made a discovery that would change everything. While calibrating a new particle detector, she noticed anomalous readings that seemed to spike whenever children played with Labubu toys nearby. The readings weren't random. They followed patterns that suggested dimensional displacement occurring at the subatomic level. These toys, she announced to a bewildered scientific community, appear to be functioning as quantum anchors for a parallel dimension. And that dimension is occupied. The breakthrough came when Dr. Tanaka's 7-year-old daughter, May, accidentally activated what turned out to be a communication device embedded in her Labubu collection. The toys began speaking, not in any human language, but in mathematical concepts that Dr. Tanaka's equipment could translate. The message was both simple and earth-shattering. We are the Labubu Collective. We have temporarily relocated your ideological extremists to prevent civilizational collapse. Please prepare for educational intervention. What followed was the most bizarre diplomatic contact in human history. The Labubu, it turned out, were a species that had evolved beyond physical forms centuries ago, existing as pure consciousness distributed across pocket dimensions. They had been observing human civilization for millennia and had grown increasingly concerned about our tendency toward ideological extremism. Your species demonstrates a fascinating but dangerous pattern. The lead Labubu communicator explained through May's toy. You require opposition to think clearly, but you allow that opposition to become so extreme it threatens your survival. We have observed 847 civilizations that destroyed themselves this way. We decided to intervene. The intervention, they explained, wasn't random. The Labubu had spent decades infiltrating human culture through what they called cuteness infiltration, designing themselves to appear harmless and desirable while studying our psychological weaknesses. They had discovered that humans were most vulnerable to ideas packaged in adorable forms, an insight they found both hilarious and deeply disturbing. You will literally buy anything if we make it cute enough, the Labubu noted with what could only be described as interdimensional amusement. Your species' susceptibility to kawaii aesthetics is a significant evolutionary vulnerability. We could have conquered you years ago with an army of talking stuffed animals, but conquest wasn't their goal. The Labubu revealed they were part of a galactic network of civilizations that had achieved something called ideological homeostasis, the ability to maintain productive opposition without descending into destructive extremism. They had been tasked with helping younger civilizations achieve this balance before they destroyed themselves. The communist abduction, they explained, was actually a mercy intervention. Your communist movements had become too disconnected from practical governance, just as your capitalist systems had become too disconnected from human welfare. Both sides were racing toward positions so extreme they would have eventually triggered a civilizational collapse event. Dr. Chun, the MIT economist, was among the first to understand the implications. They're saying that our political systems have become so polarized that they were approaching a kind of ideological event horizon, a point beyond which productive discourse becomes impossible and societies collapse into pure conflict. The Labubu confirmed this analysis. They showed humanity recordings from other civilizations that had faced similar crises. On Kepler 442b, a species had developed capitalism so extreme that 99.9% of the population became slaves to a single corporate entity. On Wolf 1061c, communism had evolved into a collective consciousness so complete that individual identity ceased to exist, causing the civilization to stagnate and die. The optimal system, the Labubu explained, requires constant tension between individual achievement and collective welfare. Remove either pole, and consciousness itself begins to deteriorate. We have temporarily removed your most extreme voices to prevent you from destroying this balance permanently. But here's where the story takes an unexpected philosophical turn. The Labubu revealed that they had been manipulating more than just political systems. They had been carefully curating human development for generations, introducing ideas and innovations at precisely calculated intervals to maintain what they called productive cognitive dissonance. Every major philosophical breakthrough in your history, they announced, has been the result of carefully managed ideological conflict. Plato versus Aristotle, Christianity versus Islam, science versus religion, capitalism versus communism. We have been introducing and maintaining these tensions to keep your mind sharp and your civilizations progressing. This revelation sparked an existential crisis that made the original disappearance look trivial. Humanity discovered that their entire intellectual history had been a carefully managed experiment. Every great thinker, every revolutionary movement, every paradigm shift had been part of an interdimensional curriculum designed to evolve human consciousness. Are you saying, asked Dr. Webb during what became known as the Oxford interview, that none of our ideas are original? That we're essentially students in some cosmic classroom? Not exactly, the Labubu replied. The ideas are genuinely yours. but the timing, the opposition, the specific conflicts that forge those ideas into useful forms. Yes, we have been managing those. Think of us as interdimensional debate coaches. This led to what philosophers quickly dubbed the authenticity paradox. If human intellectual development had been guided by outside forces, did that make human achievements less meaningful or more remarkable? Were humans more impressive for having genuine insights despite manipulation, or less impressive for needing guidance? The Labubu, seemingly anticipating this question, offered a perspective that was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Every species we have guided asks this question. The answer is that authenticity is not about the absence of influence. It is about the creative response to influence. A river is not less authentic for being shaped by its banks. A diamond is not less beautiful for being formed under pressure. But they also revealed something that chilled the blood of everyone listening. The experiment was entering a new phase. Your species is approaching a critical transition point, they announced. Within your next century, you will either achieve ideological homeostasis and join the galactic community, or you will fragment into permanent conflict and destroy yourselves. The communist relocation was phase one of your final examination. Final examination? Dr. Tanaka asked, her voice barely audible. Yes, we are going to return the relocated populations gradually, but with modifications. They will retain their core beliefs, but gain the ability to understand and appreciate their opposition. The question is, can your species learn to disagree productively, or will you interpret this gift as weakness and destroy it? The Labubu paused, and in that silence, humanity grasped the magnitude of what they were facing. This wasn't just about getting the communists back. This was about proving that human civilization could evolve beyond the destructive polarization that had characterized their entire history. Phase 2 begins in 72 hours, the Labubu announced. We suggest you prepare your minds for the most important lesson your species has ever received. And then, as suddenly as they had begun communicating, the toys fell silent, leaving humanity to contemplate a question that would determine their species' future. When your enemies return with the ability to understand your perspective, will you have developed the wisdom to understand theirs? The answer would determine whether humanity graduated to the stars or flunked out of existence entirely. 72 hours later, they began returning. The first to reappear was Chun Wei, a philosophy professor from Beijing University who had vanished during the initial wave. He materialized in Times Square at exactly noon, Eastern Standard Time, surrounded by a cloud of strawberry-scented mist and looking remarkably well-rested for someone who had been interdimensionally kidnapped. But something had changed. When reporters rushed to interview him, expecting the usual communist rhetoric about capitalist exploitation, should surprise everyone by saying, I've been thinking. Maybe Marx was asking the right questions, but some of his answers were incomplete. I'd love to have a conversation with some economists about market mechanisms. They're fascinating systems, even if they need better ethical frameworks. This was not the Chun Wei that Chinese state media remembered. Within hours, communists began reappearing worldwide. In Moscow, former Politburo members emerged discussing worker cooperatives that incorporated market feedback loops. In Havana, Castro's former advisors spoke enthusiastically about democratic socialism that protected individual entrepreneurship. In college campuses across America, students for a democratic society members returned talking about synthesis models and dialectical capitalism. Dr. Rodriguez's brain scans revealed what the Labubu had done. They've enhanced the neuroplasticity in the ideological reasoning centers, she explained to a packed auditorium at Stanford. These individuals retain their core values: equality, worker rights, collective responsibility, but they've gained an unprecedented ability to understand and integrate opposing viewpoints. It's like they've been given ideological empathy. The implications were staggering. For the first time in human history, people with fundamentally different worldviews could argue passionately while genuinely understanding their opponents' perspectives. Communist activists debated capitalist entrepreneurs not to destroy each other's positions, but to forge better solutions. Sarah Martinez, a labor organizer from Detroit who had disappeared in the original wave, explained the experience. It's like someone gave me glasses I didn't know I needed. I still believe in worker power, collective ownership, the need to challenge exploitation. But now I can see how market mechanisms actually work, why entrepreneurs take risks, how innovation happens. I'm not less communist. I'm more complete. The psychological impact rippled through society. Conservative politicians found themselves engaged in substantive policy debates with returned communist leaders, discovering that many of their concerns about economic inequality were actually shared across ideological lines. Liberal politicians were amazed to find communist activists who appreciated the role of individual initiative and market signals in efficient resource allocation. Corporate executives had perhaps the most jarring adjustment. The returned communists weren't trying to destroy capitalism. They were trying to improve it. They understand our business models better than we do, admitted tech CEO David Park. They're pointing out inefficiencies and inequities we become blind to, but they're doing it in ways that make business sense. It's terrifying and exciting at the same time. Universities experienced an intellectual renaissance. Returned Marxist professors began collaborating with free market economists on research projects that had previously been unthinkable. The University of Chicago hosted a conference called Market Socialism and Socialist Markets that attracted scholars from across the political spectrum, all eager to explore hybrid models that had been impossible to conceive when ideological tribes refused to communicate. Dr. Chun, the MIT economist, published a paper with her returned communist colleague Dr. Zhang that proposed what they called conscious capitalism, market systems with built-in feedback mechanisms for social and environmental costs. We're not abandoning either capitalism or socialism, she explained. We're transcending the false choice between them. But the most remarkable changes occurred in ordinary communities. Returned communist activists began starting businesses, worker-owned cooperatives that operated efficiently in market economies while maintaining collective ownership. Capitalist entrepreneurs partnered with communist organizers to create supply chains that prioritized both profit and worker welfare. The dating apps that had crashed earlier suddenly experienced a boom as people discovered that ideological opposites now made fascinating partners. The ability to disagree passionately while understanding each other's perspectives turned out to be incredibly attractive. My girlfriend's a communist, explained software engineer Mike Thompson. She's constantly challenging my assumptions about property rights and wage labor, but in ways that make me think harder about building ethical products. Our arguments are the best conversations I've ever had. Children adapted fastest to this new paradigm. Schools began teaching what educators called dialectical thinking, the ability to hold contradictory ideas in creative tension rather than rushing to resolve them. Kids learn to argue both sides of issues, not to be indecisive, but to understand the full complexity of problems before proposing solutions. The environmental movement was transformed. Climate activists who had returned from Labubu relocation began working with fossil fuel companies to design transition strategies that protected both the planet and workers' livelihoods. Instead of demanding immediate shutdowns, they collaborated on retraining programs and renewable energy projects that made economic sense to shareholders while accelerating decarbonization. Social media platforms scrambled to adapt their algorithms to a world where political opponents were having productive conversations instead of flame wars. Engagement actually increased, but the nature of engagement changed from outrage-driven sharing to curiosity-driven discussion. Twitter threads became collaborative problem-solving sessions. Facebook groups evolved into think tanks. Religious institutions found themselves in dialogue with returned communist atheists who brought rigorous ethical frameworks without the usual anti-religious hostility. They're asking the same questions we are, explained Pastor Johnson of Detroit's First Baptist Church. How do we build societies that care for the vulnerable? How do we balance individual fulfillment with collective responsibility? We're finding more common ground than either of us expected. But perhaps the most significant change was in how society approached problem solving. Issues that had been locked in ideological stalemate for decades suddenly saw creative breakthroughs. Healthcare systems emerged that combined market efficiency with universal access. Criminal justice reforms balanced individual accountability with systemic rehabilitation. Immigration policies addressed both humanitarian concerns and economic realities. The Labubu, monitoring from their dimensional perch, seemed pleased with humanity's progress. Occasionally, Their toys would offer cryptic encouragements, synthesis proceeding optimally, or cognitive flexibility increasing as projected. Yet tensions remained. Not everyone embraced the new paradigm. Some capitalists viewed the returning communists' ability to understand their systems as a Trojan horse strategy. Some non-abducted leftists accused the returned communists of selling out their principles. The challenge became integrating enhanced thinkers into a population that hadn't experienced the same ideological evolution. As humanity approached the 6-month anniversary of the original vanishing, the Labubu prepared for their final revelation, one that would determine whether this experiment in enhanced consciousness could be scaled to the entire species, or whether it would remain confined to the 100 million individuals they had temporarily relocated. The ultimate test of human evolution was about to begin, and with it, a choice that would echo across the galaxy for millennia to come. On the 6-month anniversary of the Great Vanishing, every Labubu toy on Earth activated simultaneously. Children in playrooms, collectors on shelves, forgotten figures in storage boxes, all began glowing with soft pink light as the interdimensional beings prepared for their final communication with humanity. The experimental phase is complete. They announced across every device, their collective voice somehow both adorable and cosmic. You have demonstrated remarkable adaptability. The enhanced individuals have successfully integrated productive dialectical thinking into your civilization's operating system. Now comes your species' final examination. Dr. Tanaka, who had become humanity's unofficial ambassador to the Labubu, asked the question everyone was thinking. What exactly are you testing us on? Your willingness to evolve, came the reply. We are prepared to offer the same cognitive enhancement we provided to the relocated individuals to your entire species. But this gift comes with a cost that not all civilizations are willing to pay. The cost, they explained, was the end of ideological certainty. The enhancement would allow every human to genuinely understand opposing viewpoints, making it impossible to maintain the comforting simplicity of absolute positions. People would retain their values and preferences, but lose the ability to dismiss alternative perspectives as obviously wrong. Many civilizations reject this offer, the Labubu continued. They prefer the psychological comfort of certainty to the cognitive complexity of wisdom. Those who refuse either stagnate in perpetual conflict or fragment into isolated ideological tribes. Both outcomes eventually lead to civilizational extinction. The announcement triggered the most significant debate in human history. World leaders, philosophers, religious figures, and ordinary citizens grapple with a question that had never before been posed. Did humanity want to become more intelligent if it meant becoming less certain? Opposition emerged immediately. This is ideological contamination, declared Senator Patricia Hayes during an emergency Senate hearing. They're asking us to abandon our core beliefs, to become wishy-washy relativists who stand for nothing. Some truths are absolute, and we shouldn't apologize for knowing right from wrong. Religious leader Imam Abdullah raised similar concerns. Faith requires certainty. If we become unable to distinguish between truth and falsehood, between righteous and sinful paths, we lose our spiritual foundation. But the enhanced individuals offered a different perspective. Dr. Zhang, the returned philosopher, addressed these concerns in what became known as the Harvard response. Enhanced cognition doesn't eliminate values. It strengthens them by freeing them from the need to distort reality. I'm more committed to human equality now than ever before, but I no longer need to pretend that market mechanisms don't work or that individual initiative doesn't matter. Truth becomes clearer when you stop filtering it through ideological lenses. The debate revealed fascinating patterns. Younger generations overwhelmingly supported the enhancement, viewing ideological rigidity as a cognitive limitation their parents had unfortunately inherited. Older generations split along lines that didn't correlate with traditional political affiliations. Some conservative leaders endorsed the change as a path to more effective governance, while some progressive activists feared losing the moral clarity that fueled their movements. Scientists were almost universally in favor. This is the next step in human cognitive evolution, argued Dr. Rodriguez. We've developed tools to enhance our physical capabilities, our mathematical abilities, our sensory perceptions. Why would we refuse to enhance our capacity for wisdom? Artists and writers faced a particular dilemma. Would enhanced empathy diminish the passion that drove great art? Could literature maintain its power if authors could no longer create compelling villains they genuinely despised? Maya Chun, a novelist whose dystopian fiction had been inspired by her hatred of capitalist exploitation, found herself conflicted. My writing comes from anger at injustice. If I can understand and empathize with those who perpetuate injustice, will I lose the fire that makes my work meaningful? The enhanced individuals assured her otherwise. Understanding your opponents doesn't mean accepting their actions, explained returned activist Sarah Martinez. If anything, understanding the psychology behind harmful behavior makes you more effective at changing it. You can't heal what you refuse to diagnose. Economic markets reacted with characteristic volatility to the uncertainty. Some sectors crashed as investors feared the end of predictable political cycles. Others soared as analysts recognized the potential for unprecedented policy stability and international cooperation. The environmental implications were particularly compelling. Climate scientists argued that enhanced cognition could be humanity's last hope for addressing existential threats that required both technological innovation and social transformation. We need solutions that transcend the traditional left-right divide, explained Dr. Susan Park. This enhancement could make that possible. Religious institutions split in fascinating ways. Some viewed the offer as divine providence, a gift that would allow humanity to better understand God's truth by seeing it from multiple perspectives. Others saw it as satanic temptation, designed to erode the faithful certainty that faith required. The Labubu, observing these debates with interdimensional amusement, offered occasional clarifications through their toy avatars. Enhancement doesn't eliminate disagreement, they explained. If anything, it intensifies meaningful disagreement while eliminating pointless conflict. Enhanced beings argue more passionately than ever, but about solutions rather than problems, about implementation rather than recognition. As the global debate intensified, something remarkable happened. The conversation itself began demonstrating the benefits of enhanced thinking. People who had never seriously engaged with opposing viewpoints found themselves forced to do so. Conservative pundits interviewed enhanced communist activists and discovered nuanced positions that challenged their assumptions. Progressive leaders debated unenhanced libertarian economists and found themselves articulating their values more clearly than ever before. The quality of public discourse improved even among the unenhanced, as if the mere presence of people capable of sophisticated ideological thinking was raising everyone's intellectual game. 3 weeks before the deadline the Labubu had set for humanity's decision, an unexpected coalition emerged. Enhanced and unenhanced individuals from across the political spectrum signed what became known as the Cognitive Courage Manifesto. We choose wisdom over certainty, it read. We choose complexity over simplicity. We choose the difficult path of understanding our opponents over the easy path of dismissing them. We believe that humanity's greatest achievements have come from holding contradictory truths in creative tension, and we are ready to take that capacity to the next level. But the manifesto was not universally endorsed. Significant populations across the globe rejected enhancement, creating what philosophers dubbed the cognitive divide. The potential for humanity to split into two subspecies based on their approach to processing ideological information. As the deadline approached, the Labubu offered one final piece of information that would frame humanity's choice. Of the 847 civilizations we have observed, 312 accepted enhancement. Of those 312, all achieved interstellar civilization within 500 years. Of the 535 who refused, 534 are extinct. The remaining civilization exists in a state of permanent technological stagnation, having achieved neither progress nor peace. The choice was clear. The consequences were cosmic, and the clock was ticking. Humanity chose enhancement, not unanimously. About 78% of the global population accepted the cognitive upgrade, while 22% opted to remain unchanged. But it was enough. The Labubu pronounced the experiment a success and began the gradual process of enhancing human consciousness worldwide. The transformation wasn't instant or painless. The first months brought what psychologists called ideological integration syndrome, a period of cognitive dissonance as enhanced minds struggled to reconcile previously incompatible worldviews. Support groups formed to help people navigate the complexity of suddenly understanding their former enemies' perspectives. But the results spoke for themselves. Within 2 years, humanity achieved breakthroughs that had been impossible under the old paradigm. Sustainable economic models that satisfied both efficiency and equity concerns, international cooperation agreements that balance sovereignty with collective action, and technological innovations that emerge from unprecedented collaboration between former ideological opponents. The unenhanced populations didn't disappear or become marginalized. Instead, they served a crucial function as cognitive anchors, people whose passionate commitment to specific positions provided the ideological diversity that enhanced individuals needed to maintain their dialectical thinking. The enhanced could understand multiple perspectives, but they needed access to people who embodied those perspectives authentically. Perhaps most remarkably, the divide between enhanced and unenhanced created new forms of collaboration. Enhanced individuals became translators between opposing unenhanced groups, helping traditional adversaries find common ground while ensuring that no important perspective was lost in the synthesis. As I finish this story, I'm struck by a question that lingers beyond the narrative's end. What would you choose? If tiny pink creatures with vampire teeth offer to make you wiser but less certain, would you accept? Would you trade the comfortable simplicity of knowing you're right for the complex responsibility of understanding when you might be wrong? The Labubu understood something profound about human nature. We need our contradictions to grow, our opponents to sharpen our thinking, our uncertainties to keep us humble. Maybe that's the real lesson here. The cure for ideological extremism isn't the elimination of ideology, but the enhancement of our capacity to hold multiple ideologies in creative tension. After all, the most interesting conversations happen not when everyone agrees, but when people who disagree actually understand what they're disagreeing about. And sometimes, the most profound truths emerge from the most absurd scenarios, even ones involving interdimensional toy collectors with questionable aesthetic choices. So the next time you see a Labubu toy, remember, sometimes the universe's deepest wisdom comes packaged in the most unexpected forms. And sometimes, salvation arrives not through the elimination of our differences, but through the enhancement of our ability to engage with them thoughtfully. The future, it turns out, belongs to those brave enough to evolve.